the government has made an interesting announcement about cars. New cars and vans powered wholly by petrol and diesel will not be sold in the UK from 2030. That's according to the Prime Minister. He confirmed, however, that some hybrids would still be allowed. It seems like a very ambitious target. I certainly hope that it can be achieved. Chaitanya Kumar is the head of environmental and green transitions at the New Economics Foundation and joins me now. A very good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon, John. Nice to be on this.
It's good to have you. It is quite an ambitious target. Do you think the government will manage to realise it? I noticed that lots of the car companies have been saying they think it'll be very tough to get there by 2030.
An important thing to note is car companies often complain, but when it comes to regulation, they've always responded ultimately quite aggressively with any targets that the government sets. I mean, we've been setting carbon emission limits for vehicles for the last decade and a half, and they've been consistently being met by car companies. I think this is very much an eminently sensible and feasible target, but it's nonetheless quite ambitious. So car companies will have to go faster. You and I, people who drive, for example, will potentially have to start moving towards electric vehicles. But we're talking about a ban coming 10 years from now, not right now. So the goal will be to try and make sure these cars are as cheap as possible, and certainly cheaper than your petrol and diesel alternatives. Otherwise, there's no incentive for anybody out there to buy the alternative electric vehicle.
Of course. Will we still be allowed to keep our old petrol cars?
Yes, yeah, very much so, yes. It's unclear how the regulation might change post-2030, i.e. if you're driving a car that was, say, for example, bought in 2010, and if you're expecting to drive post-2030, that's unlikely. The average lifetime of a car on the street right now is about 14 years. And given the technology is moving so fast, you probably feel like you're driving an old jalopy by the time it's 2030. So you probably will keep the car, but it'll become quite obsolete by then.
Okay. Now, there are other targets included in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. For example, on offshore wind, he's talking about producing enough offshore wind to power every home in the UK. Now, the Prime Minister used to mock and ridicule offshore wind. Was he wrong then? Is he wrong now, or is he just a charlatan who doesn't really care what he says at any given time?
I think he was certainly wrong back then. Perhaps he was just playing to the gallery back then.
Oh, really?
He's certainly seen I think the primary driver of the change in his tone and his language has been jobs. The offshore wind industry has proven that it can create jobs in places that have been deindustrialized for the last 3 to 4 decades, sort of the left behind, the stranded communities that we've seen. So I think that is a strong motivator for the Prime Minister. But beyond that, we're seeing climate change being taken very seriously. The fact that we've got a new administration in the White House, Joe Biden coming in, he's made it very clear that climate change is going to be the top three of his political agenda. And if for a country that's trying to sign a trade deal with the United States, climate change, for that reason too, is very much an important political agenda item for us now. So I think climate change, the jobs, and the fact that it's a good thing for the economy.
What about nuclear power?
Right.
Because people were so excited about that in the 60s, weren't they? That was the Harold Wilson white heat of the technological revolution. Tony Benn as energy minister opening nuclear power plants, and then a decade later, lots of people began to think it was dangerous because, of course, of the accidents that had happened. Should we be scared of nuclear energy these days?
Oh, not at all. The challenge with nuclear, of course, is back in 2011 when we had the tsunami in Japan. It created a lot of fear, and rightly so, around the world. Perfect example being Germany, that basically decided to shut down all its nuclear fleet, and it's already doing that in response to the incidents back in Japan in 2011. Having said that, the challenge right now is less about safety and more about cost. The economics of nuclear energy just doesn't stack up. If you remember, EDF, the French company that is building the Hinkley Point C nuclear plant, essentially said that we'll be cooking our turkeys for Christmas with nuclear power from Hinkley in 2017. Now the
Delicious.
the plant is yet to be built till 2026 at the earliest. So we're talking about significant delays, and we're just not able to build at scale when it comes to nuclear, and it becomes more and more expensive.
Why is it now safe?
Well, in the sense that the technology has evolved. We know how nuclear energy works. We know how to keep it safe. And let's be honest, like we have seen incidents like the 3 Mile Island or the one like I mentioned in Japan, which became sort of totemic aspects of why nuclear energy perhaps is unsafe. And the fallout of potential nuclear risk is significant. I'm not denying that at all. Having said that, the technology has evolved. We are a much better place where we can actually deal with nuclear energy much more safely. The question of disposal of nuclear waste is very much a challenge, but it will remain a challenge over the long term. But for when you're thinking about climate change and thinking about cutting carbon emissions, nuclear energy is part of the mix, part of the solution basket, if you can think of it that way, that we need to consider. And that's what this government is doing.
Now, one that leaps out, one of the 10 points that he's raised that leaps out, I can't imagine many people object to, is protection and restoration of the natural environment, with plans to vastly increase the number of hectares of trees that are being planted every year. I know that in Scotland that's already taking place, with efforts being made to restore the Great Caledonian Forest all across the centre and north of the country, because these islands were artificially deforested, weren't they? Absolutely,
yeah. I mean, 30,000 hectares is quite significant. We're talking about a much larger afforestation program that needs to be undertaken in the country. The Committee on Climate Change, which are the official advisors to the government, basically say 30,000 hectares is the lower end of their estimate. They think anywhere between 45, 50 to almost up to 60,000 hectares of forest has to be created on an annual basis. So that's quite a challenge, yeah.